So in the previous video, I mentioned that our next step would be to do an update or an upgrade of our vSphere environment, our nested vSphere lab environment. However, I also want to take a few moments and set up a distributed switch and also set up vMotion. So if needed, we can go ahead and move the vCenter server appliance in our nested environment from ESXi over to B or A in the event we want to go ahead and do updates to the host. So in this video, we get to do all those things. In fact, let's put a quick game plan together. So regarding ESXi nested hosts A, B, and C, let's go ahead and take the cluster that they're in. Let's enable distributed resource scheduler. Let's also create a virtual distributed switch. We'll also make sure that we have licensing applied to those 3 ESXi hosts. And then once we have our distributed switch that's common among all 3 ESXi hosts, let's also go ahead and set up vMotion. So we'll create a port group just for that. Let's use VLAN 3 for vMotion, and for VM kernel adapters that support vMotion, let's go ahead and use 10.3.0. And then we'll use the actual last octet that we're using currently on each of these on the management network, and that would be 31 and 32 and 33. And then once we have that in place, we'll go ahead and we'll do our update of our vCenter server that's part of our nested lab environment, and then we'll follow that up by doing an update of the actual ESXi hypervisor software running on each of these hosts. And again, this is all going to be inside of our nested lab environment. So let's begin by heading over to our nested vCenter. So here is our nested vSphere environment, and we are logged on as administrator at vSphere.nested. Fantastic. And let's go to our host and clusters view, and we'll go to our cluster here, right click on it, and click on settings, which takes us over to the configure tab for that cluster. And let's enable DRS by clicking on the 3 dots here because of my font size. We'll click on edit, and we'll go ahead and enable DRS. And instead of saying fully automated, I'm going to say partially automated. That way I can make the final choices in a live environment regarding what's going to be migrated. And then we'll click on OK. Next, let's set up a distributed switch in our nested environment. So I didn't actually make a plan for how many uplinks. We have 6 uplinks in total. Let's go ahead and let's use, how about 4 of them? So we'll go to our data center here. We'll right click on our data center. And from the drop down, we'll click on distributed switch, and we'll create a new distributed switch. So let's call this nested VDS and click on next. And we'll go ahead and support version 8 and later. That's great. We'll click on next. And then for the number of uplinks, let's go ahead and use 4. And I don't want to create a default port group. And we'll click on next and click on finish. Now, one thing to remember is that if we're going to be using a distributed switch as part of in the future with NSX, we want to make sure that any switches we use are supporting jumbo frames, something larger than the default of 1500. So I'm going to go for 9000 on these switches. So we'll click on the nested VDS, right click, and then from the menu, we'll click here on settings, and then we'll edit the settings for this distributed switch. And then if we click on the advanced subtab, I'm going to go ahead and specify an MTU of 9000. That'll be more than enough. I'm also going to say I want to enable link layer discovery protocol and advertise and listen. And then for the uplinks, let's make a plan. So these 4 uplinks, because the 3 servers, the 3 ESXi hosts are all exactly the same, I'm going to rename these uplinks to reflect the actual uplinks we want to use on each of those hosts. So here I'm going to say use vmnic 0, which is currently already in use. We'll have to migrate a VM kernel adapter. And then for the second uplink, we'll name that use vmnic 1, and we'll repeat that logic for the other 2 as well. All right, so on the distributed switch, those are the names. Then we go to map those to the individual uplinks on the ESXi host to be very clear where to put them. Now, because vmnic 0 is already in use with the VM kernel adapter, we're going to have to deal with that when the time comes, which is coming right up. So we'll deal with that together. So we'll click on OK. And if we click on configure and we go to topology, here is our distributed switch. We have absolutely no port groups associated with it. And we have 4 named uplinks. However, we don't have any physical NICs as part of the ESXi hosts, which are yet mapped to those uplinks. So let's start off by creating a port group that we're going to use for vMotion. So we'll right click on our distributed switch, and from the drop down, we'll click here on distributed port group, and then we'll click on new distributed port group. And again, for a full detailed explanation and walkthrough regarding distributed switching and port groups and all that, please check out our content over at CBT Nuggets. All right, so for this port group, I'm going to go ahead and call it nested vMotion and click on next. And then we want to use VLAN 3, so we'll click here on VLAN, and then we'll specify 3 for the VLAN. And then I want to specify the other details here, or at least look at them, so I will click here in the advanced checkbox, click on next, And I'm going to go ahead and accept MAC address changes and forge transmits and also enable Mac learning. Although for vMotion, some of that won't be too important, but if I get in the habit of doing that, when we get into our NSX environment, by enabling these features, it'll help avoid problems with NSX as well. So again, here for the vMotion one, it isn't too critical, but I just want to get us in the habit of doing that. And then we'll go ahead and click on next and next. And here are uplinks. So for this port group for vMotion, let's go ahead and I'm going to take all of these uplinks and say move down, and I just want to use vmnic1. So we'll go ahead and take vmnic1, move it up in the active position, and for my lab environment, that'll be more than enough. So we'll click on next and next and next and finish. And now we have our nested vMotion port group associated with VLAN 3. So let me go ahead and associate our 3 ESXi hosts, A, B, and C, so they can go ahead and use this nested VDS. So I'll right click on the nested VDS. From the menu, click on Add and Manage Hosts, and then we'll add hosts and click on Next, and then we'll grab all 3. Oh, and you know what? This may be a little bit tricky, so it'll be a good exercise. Our vCenter, our nested vCenter, is running on ESXi. That's this host at 192.168.1.33. And so we're going to need to migrate that VM over because we're going to be allocating the uplink, which we're currently using, or I should say the vCenter server appliance is currently using. So we'll also need to make sure we migrate the vCenter server appliance as part of this process. So we'll click on next. And then for the mapping, I want each host vMnic0 to be associated with this uplink called use vMnic0, and I'll do the same process for 1 and for 2 and for 3. And then we'll leave 4 and 5 alone. We'll click on next. And now we have a warning. We have VM kernel network adapters on each of our hosts that are currently using a standard switch, and that standard switch is currently using vMnic0. So if we want to still maintain connectivity, we're going to need to migrate the VM kernel adapters over. And I just realized I don't have a port group for my management network, which would be effectively no 802.1q tagging, just send the frame out without a tag. So I'm going to click on cancel here. And before we try to add those hosts to this distributed switch, let me go ahead and add a port group for management. So we'll right click on the distributed switch. We'll click on distributed port group, click on new distributed port group. And I'll call the name of this port group Nested Management to 192 because effectively that's what it's going to be doing. Click on Next. And for the VLAN, I'm going to say no VLAN tagging. And for advanced, I'll click on Next. And I'm going to go ahead and say, please allow everything as far as MAC address changes and forge transmits. Let's also enable Mac learning. That'd be great. And click on Next and Next. And then for the uplinks here, for this port group for management, let's just use vMnic0 with the backup of vMnic1. So I'm going to go ahead and take 2 and 3 and push them out of the way. And then go ahead and grab vMnic1 and move it down as a standby link because it likes to have a lot of fault tolerance for management. So here we have some. We have one link primarily used and the other one being used as a backup. And we'll click on Next and Next and Next. And then we'll click on Finish. All right, so now we have these 2 port groups. And now when we add the hosts to become part of this distributed switch and we take away their vMnic0, we can migrate the VM kernel adapters over to this port group. And we can also migrate the vCenter server appliance, the nested one, over to this port group as well for connectivity to the 192 network. All right, so now let's go ahead and right click on the virtual distributed switch. And from the menu, click on Add and Manage Hosts. And then we'll use the radio button here next to Add Host. That's already in place. We'll click on Next. We'll grab all 3 hosts, click on Next, and then we'll specify the uplinks we want to associate with this new distributed switch, which is the first 4, 0, 1, 2, and 3. We'll click on Next. And we're going to want to use this one right here, the nested management to 192. Fantastic. So that's in place. We'll click on Next. As far as VMs, yes, we want to migrate the vCenter server appliance over because we're about, on ESXi, we're about to take away the uplink 0 that's being used with the standard switch, which is currently in use by this network adapter on the vCenter server appliance. So there it shows us 1 virtual machine, 1 network adapter. We can also configure per virtual machine, but since we only have 1, it's going to be the same information. So there's our VCSA nested. And let's go ahead and migrate that over from the standard switch over to this port group nested management to 192 on the distributed switch and click on Next. Now, before we click on Finish here, one of the beautiful things about making configuration changes regarding networking is that if it doesn't work, meaning if we try to push out a configuration where the vCenter loses connectivity with the ESXi host it's managing, it'll go ahead and roll those changes back. So we're not too much at risk here. So we'll click on Finish And I'm going to keep my eye right here on this, and hopefully it's going to finish and come back solid. And if there's a problem, it'll come back with an error, and we have an error right there. So what it's going to do in the background right now, it's going to roll that back because we've lost communications, or it believes we've lost communications between the vCenter and the ESXi host that vCenter is managing. So I'm going to hit F5 to do a refresh of this entire page. So notice here that we don't have any VM kernel adapters in this port group, and we also don't have any of the uplinks of those hosts, and that's because it wasn't able to complete because there was a problem. So let's go ahead and sort this out by going back to the distributed switch and clicking on Add and Manage Hosts, and let's remove any host that might have got moved over. Yeah, it didn't go well, so we'll go ahead and remove those, click on Next, and click on Finish. And I think the problem was we were just trying to move too much at one time. Well, let's do this. Let's go to the Host and Clusters view, and let's take a look at these warning messages here. Network connectivity loss. Yep, we know that happened. So I'm going to click on Monitor, go to the cluster level, click on Monitor, and then I'm going to go ahead and take all of these and reset them to green because we're aware of those. Fantastic. All right, so here on this host right here, which is the one that's running the vCenter server appliance, and let's add a port group on its standard switch, and let's use, like, for example, vMNIC 5. We're not currently using that in our distributed switch environment, and then we can move the vCenter server appliance over to that standard port group. That way, when we do the migration over to the distributed switch, we're not trying to do all the VM kernel adapters and also the vCenter server itself all at the same time. We can do it in stages. I think that'll solve the problem. If it doesn't, we'll troubleshoot it together. So here on this host, 192.168.1.33, we'll click on Configure, and let's go down to Networking, Virtual Switches. So here, as we look at the virtual switches, you know what? Actually, let's just create a brand new temporary virtual switch with its own dedicated uplink, and that way we can just stay clear of anything else that might already be in place here. Because we're already using the VM kernel adapter associated with the standard switch, which is using vMNIC 0. So let's create a new standard switch. So we'll click on Add Networking here on ESXi. And this option will do it for us. Virtual machine port group for a standard switch. It'll also give us the option of creating a new standard switch. So right here, we'll say new standard switch, and we can leave that at 1500 for this temporary switch. We'll click on Next. And then for the vMNICs, let's use vMNIC 5 temporarily. So I'll go ahead and select that. Click on Move Down into the active section right here. Click on Next. And let's call this temp 192 because that's where it's going to go to because we're not doing any tagging. Click on Next and click on Finish. All right, so it should show up right here. There it is. There's our standard vSwitch 1 with this port group and that uplink. Fantastic. So we're just going to migrate the vCenter server appliance, which is currently up here on this port group with this virtual switch using this uplink, and we'll simply move it down here to temp 192, which is part of a different virtual switch and a different uplink. And that way, when we do the migration of vMNIC 0, 1, 2, and 3, it won't bother the vCenter. So it'll do one less change in vSphere when we move over to a distributed switch. And then we can take a second step once we have the distributed switch in place and migrate our vCenter server appliance over to our distributed switch networking. All right, so let's go ahead to our VMs and templates view, go to our vCenter. We'll go ahead and right click on vCenter there, click on Edit Settings, and let's go to the network and move it over to this one right there. And we'll click on OK and click on OK. And here, because it didn't bulk at us, that implies that that worked. That's fantastic. So now let's go back to our networking tab up here. And to see a quick bird's eye view, we can click on the distributed switch, click on Configure, go to Topology View, and here is our two port groups. There's the 4 uplinks we're going to use. And now we'll right click on that distributed switch. We'll click on Add and Manage Hosts and click on Add Hosts right there. Click on Next, select all 3 hosts, click on Next. Then we'll say we want to use this one, and this one, and this one, and this one. Fantastic. Click on Next. Now the VM kernel adapters, they still need to come over because they're currently on the standard switch using vMNIC 0, and we'll associate each of the hosts' VM kernel 0 adapter over to this new port group nested management to 192. So we'll click on Assign there, and then click on the arrows to go back just to confirm it's still there. Fantastic. Click on Next. And now we don't need to migrate our vCenter server appliance because it's already on a different switch using a different uplink. We're not going to impact it. So all we're really doing is we're adding these 3 hosts, moving their VM kernel adapters over to the new distributed switch, and we're leaving vCenter alone, so it's one less change. Let's see if this is going to take by clicking on Next. And then here's a summary, and we'll click on Finish. And if that little dial stops without an error, that is a very, very Good sign. And yay! And then what we should also see here is these should be updated and populate showing the 3 VM kernel adapters. Fantastic. And we should also show the vMNIC 0 off each of the 3 hosts for the first uplink, and then the vMNIC 1 on the 3 hosts for the second uplink, and so forth. That looks fantastic. So our next step, let's go ahead and migrate the vCenter server appliance and place it on this port group right here instead of the temporary switch we have on ESXi. So to do that, we'll go over to the VM and templates view. We'll right-click on our vCSA nested, which is our vCenter server in our nested environment. Click on Edit Settings for that VM, and we'll go to the network and say, you know what, instead of temp 192, let's go ahead and put you on this distributed port group called Nested Management to 192. Click on OK, and then we're going to make sure that it takes, and we are still connected. So that isn't perpetually spinning. There's no indicator of a loss of connectivity, and that looks good. So we could also clean up by going back to our host and clusters view, going back to ESXi right here, going to networking, and now that we're not using switch 1, so here we have no VMs, we could just go ahead and delete that virtual switch because we're no longer using it at all. All right, and it is gone. Also, if we look at vSwitch 0, we're not using it either, so we could also clean that up as well because we're not using that either on any of our ESXi hosts. So we'll remove it, click on yes, and now all we have on ESXi is the distributed switch and no standard switches, and we can do the same type of cleanup over on ESXi-A. Here's our standard switch 0. We're not using it, just to confirm. Yep, no VMs there. So we'll go ahead and click on the 3 dots. We'll remove it, click on yes, and very similar treatment for ESXi-B. So we'll go to the standard switch, click on the 3 dots. In fact, let me just peek and make sure we're not using it. Yep, we're not using it. So we'll go ahead and click on the 3 dots, click on remove, and click on yes, and it is gone. All right, so next, now that we have our distributed switch and all 3 hosts are participating as part of that distributed switch, and we have a port group for vMotion, let's go ahead and add VM kernel adapters on each of our ESXi hosts so they can actually use vMotion. So one of the fastest ways, other than a script and some automation of doing that, is to go to Configure for the distributed switch, and then go to the topology view right here, and then for this nested vMotion, we can click on the 3 dots and add VM kernel adapters. We also could have just gone over here to nested vMotion, right-click there, and clicked on Add VM kernel adapters. Either way works great. So we'll click on Add VM kernel adapters. We'll select all 3 hosts, click on Next. It's going to get the MTU, the maximum transmission unit from the switch, which is 9,000. Fantastic. Let's use the TCP/IP stack specifically for vMotion. Click on Next, and then for IP addressing, we're going to use the 10.3.0 address space based on our plan. So for ESXi-A, it's going to be 10.3.0.31 with a 24-bit mask. And then we'll use .32 for ESXi-B and .33 for ESXi-C. And then for the mask, we use the same mask for all of them as well. And we really don't need a default gateway on our vMotion network. So we'll click on Next and Finish. So now we have vMotion capabilities on each of our ESXi hosts. So if we went back to our host and clusters view here and clicked on, for example, ESXi-A and clicked on VM kernel adapters, here showing us that VMK1, let me scooch this over a little bit to the left here, is enabled for vMotion, and on ESXi-B, similar treatment right there. VMK1 set up for vMotion, and ESXi-C is also set up for vMotion. And then we're going to follow the process for doing an update of our ESXi host and also for vCenter, the nested vCenter. And the appropriate process would be update vCenter first and then update the ESXi host. So let's go ahead and update the vCenter itself. And to do that, we're going to go to the management interface for our vCenter. And just as a reminder, our vCenter is at 192.168.1.35. And so we'd go to that IP address, :5480 for TCP port 5480, and that is the management interface for our vCenter. So here we'll log on to the management console for our nested vSphere. Again, we could log in here as this single sign-on user, or we could log on as the local user root. Either way would work. We'll supply the password and click Login. So currently we're running 8.0.1 and change, and so what we'll do is on the left-hand side, we'll go down to Update. So it is going out right now and checking to see what the latest and greatest version of vCenter is. And if there's updates more current than 8.0.1.00, etc., they'll be listed right here. Now, in your lab environment, when you go to Update and you click here on Check Updates, if it has a failure or it can't reach the internet, that's going to prevent the updates from showing up here as well. So you'd want to go back and make sure that under networking that you have your IP addresses set up correctly, your default gateway set up correctly, your name resolution set up, and that'd be the first thing to check. All right, so let's sort based on the release date, and the latest and greatest is right here, 8.0.2.00100. So we'll go ahead and select that, and I'm going to go ahead and do a stage and install. So we'll go ahead and scroll down, and in a production environment, we'd want to make sure we took a backup of our vCenter first. But for now, I'm going to go ahead and simply wing it. So let's go ahead and accept the agreement and click on Next. It's running some pre-update checks, including to see whether or not you have a backup or that you have made a backup. All right, so here are the pre-update check results. We'll go ahead and click on Ignore and Continue, and we won't join the Customer Experience Improvement Program. Click on Next. And then we'll check on the box that says I've backed up my vCenter, because if you don't check that box, it will not let you continue. So if you remove that check, you don't get the Finish button there. So we'll go ahead and check it. Click on Finish, and away it goes. Now, a big part of this is going to be the initial download. So in a production environment, it would be wise to not do anything else while this is happening. However, because I know it's going to take a while for that download, while that's happening, let's go update at least one or two of our ESXi hosts as well. So to do that, we're going back to the vSphere client, which is going to be available probably for another 15 minutes while that download happens and it gets ready for the update. So let's go to our host and clusters view. We'll select our nested cluster there, and let's click on the Updates tab. So the Updates tab is over here on the right. Because of my font size, I got to click on the three dots there. There it is right there, Updates. And there's our base image that we're targeting. And let's go ahead and check on compliance by clicking the button that says Check Compliance. So in the background, it's running a compliance check, and when it's done, it's going to come back and say, you know what? All three of these hosts don't match up, and they're not compliant, because they're running an older version of the hypervisor. So this is 8.0U22238. And if we look at one of the hosts here and go to the Summary tab, it's running an older version of an 8.01 flavor. So that compliance check is still running. And then when it's done, we'll go ahead and do an update or two. And as I mentioned, in a production environment, if we had already started the update of the vCenter, it would be wise to wait till that's completely done, because it is vCenter with the Lifecycle Manager that is coordinating these updates. So I think we'll have time to do at least one here. So let's go ahead and just grab the first one, ESXi, and we'll go ahead and click on the actions, and let's go ahead and click on Remediate. And we'll accept the terms, click on Start Remediation, and now vCenter, while it's still running, is in the process of working with ESXi to deploy the updated image on ESXi. Also down here regarding ESXi, it's also giving us a little warning message about the actual CPU that's not fully supported by VMware. And we knew that when we deployed the ESXi software in the first place, because it gave us those warnings there as well. So here for ESXi, if we click here on See More, it'll give us the play-by-play as vCenter interacts with ESXi performing the update. And if we tab over, here to the vCenter Management Console, it is also in the process of doing the update. So hopefully ESXi will complete its update before vCenter has to do its own logical reboot. So here is the play-by-play for ESXi, and it is on its way. So it's going to put it in maintenance mode, and then it's going to deploy the new image. And then if it requires a reboot, it'll be rebooted. And down here, it indicates that that is exactly the case. It's going to go ahead and do a quick boot to reboot that OS, which is a little bit faster than doing a full hard restart of that host. So again, I'm hoping this will completely finish while vCenter is still active, because we're doing that simultaneous update of vCenter. All right, well, ESXi has been placed in maintenance mode. That's great. And now it's installing the image. So looks like we'll be in good shape time-wise for at least one of those hosts to be updated before vCenter becomes unresponsive due to its current update. So as far as the game plan, here's what I'd like to do. I'm going to go ahead and we'll let the ESXi finish its update. We'll also let the vCenter finish its update, and then when the vCenter is done, I'll come back and I'll go ahead and we'll continue on with the update of ESXi-B right here, and also ESXi-C. And when it comes time for ESXi-C, we'll also have an opportunity to validate whether or not our vMotion is functional, because we'll need to move our vCenter off of ESXi3 over to a different host while we do the update of ESXi-C. So as we check the status of our update, vCenter has done the reboot now of ESXi-A. Fantastic. So once it comes back up, it'll go ahead and remove it out of maintenance mode. It'll check compliance for the cluster again, and we'll have our first of our 3 hosts updated. And then also, assuming everything works out, the update for the vCenter itself will also complete. So what we'll do is we'll just pause it right there, and then we'll come back after vCenter is done with its update. We'll verify ESXi1 is up to date, and then we'll proceed. All right, great news. This installation, the update for the vCenter is complete, and that process took over an hour to finish. So it is now done. So let's go ahead and close that. And we are now running at 8.0.2, etc. So let's go back into the vSphere client. So here at the vSphere client, we'll go ahead and log in. And it's reminding me I need to associate my appropriate licenses with these 3 ESXi hosts. So let me go ahead and do that right now. We'll click on the hamburger menu, go down to Administration, and then click on Licenses. And then from here, we'll go to Assets and Hosts, and I'll select these 3 ESXi hosts. Click right here on Assign License. Click on Yes to continue, and then assign this license I have for them. And then we'll click on OK, and then we'll dismiss that warning saying thank you very much. And we'll go back to the inventory view. So here at the cluster with update selected, so the one host that is compliant is .31, that's ESXi-A. And so if we want to go ahead and update ESXi-B and C, we can do that, but we'll need to migrate the vCenter server appliance, which is currently running as a VM over on ESXi-C. So actually, let's do the migration of that VM right now from ESXi-C over to ESXi-A. So we'll right-click on the vCenter, click on Migrate, and let's go ahead and change both the compute resource and storage because I don't have any shared storage in that cluster. We'll click on Next, and then we'll go ahead and place that on ESXi-A right there. We'll click on Next, and we'll put it on the first data store, which is that guy right there. We'll make sure we're using thin provisioning, and click on Next. And we have the same port groups available on both hosts. That's great. We'll click on Next and click on Next and Finish. All right, so that migration is in motion. If we look at recent tasks, there it goes. And while it's migrating that vCenter server appliance from ESXi-C over to A, let's go ahead and do the update of ESXi-B at .32. So we'll go back to our cluster. With the update selected, we'll go down and let's select ESXi-B, which is at .32. And let's go ahead and do the update. So we'll go ahead and do the remediate and click on Start Remediation, and away it goes. So in about, 5 or so minutes, ESXi-B at .32 will also have an updated version of the ESXi hypervisor that's matching the requirements for the cluster with this version right here. And then once the vMotion completes to move the vCenter from ESXi-C over to ESXi-A, we'll also do the remediation for ESXi-C as well. All right, so the relocation of the vCenter server appliance is happening, and the remediation at .32 on ESXi-B is also in motion. So we'll wait for both of those to complete, and then once it's done, we'll proceed to do our update of ESXi-C here at .33. All right, so it looks like here on ESXi-A, if we click on the VMs tab, there's the vCenter server appliance running. And if we look at host B right here and go to summary, it currently has the latest and greatest version. And if we go to host C, now that it's no longer running the vCenter server appliance, we can go ahead and update it as well. So let's go back to the cluster, click on updates, and it's showing us one host is not compliant. And that's this guy right here, .33. That's ESXi-C. And it looks like it is in the background doing a compliance check. So we'll let that finish. Once it's done, we'll go ahead and we'll remediate ESXi-C and bring it up to speed as well. All right, so that compliance check is done. This is the host that's out of compliance. And if we look at the differences here, it's currently running 8.0 U1A, yada yada, and we want to update to 8.0 U2 with a more current image version. So we can go ahead and do the actions here and say remediate or just remediate all. And because there's only one host, we'll click on Start Remediation, and it's off to the races for updating ESXi-C. So let's chat for a moment about what is next. Now that we have this nested total vSphere environment with a distributed switch, 3 ESXi hosts, and everything's up to date, our next logical step is then to go ahead and begin the deployment of our NSX lab on top of this nested infrastructure. So join me in the next video as we take a look at now implementing on top of this infrastructure NSX. I'll see you there when you're ready.